We appreciate you joining us here midsummer as we begin turning the page and looking at H2B for 2024. Couple of things in regards to the webinar. We have over 100 attendees logging in today, so all lines will be muted. But if you could please log in and check for your question box, and we will be utilizing this to ask questions throughout the presentation. This will help us after the presentations. We have a few slides to go over with you. We would like to address as many questions as we possibly can. I know we logged about 30 minutes for this webinar, so please at any time, Donna's on the back end here with us today, and she'll be monitoring those questions and getting them to myself or Laurie, our guest speaker today. So with that, I do want to get started and introduce Laurie Flanagan. She is FEWA's lobbyist. We've been working together for many years. She's also the executive vice president at DC LRS and based in DC, and secretary at the H2B Workforce Coalition. FEWA also sits on the executive committee of the H2B Workforce Coalition. And what we want to touch base on today is one of the biggest limiting factors to the H2B program, which is the H2B cap. We all know that many of you that have been participating in the program, or many of you that are looking to participate in the program, there's two significant points that we have to prove in order to be able to qualify for the program. One, every year, regardless of how many years we've been participating, we have to prove that we have a temporary need for the program. And we do that by working with 4 different governmental agencies: the State Workforce Agency, the U.S. Department of Labor, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service, and the U.S. Department of State. But we also have to prove that there are no domestic workers available for us in testing the local labor market. And we help you through that process each and every year in order for us to be qualified and certified by the U.S. Department of Labor in order to bring in foreign workers. That's just part of the process. And that's part of the process regardless if you've been involved in 20 plus years or if it's your first year in the H2B process applying. We can go through that entire certification and application process, but the one limiting factor that we're going to talk about today is the 66,000 cap on the program that's been around since the early 90s and has not changed permanently in the past. Now, Laurie's been, very active in DC, and we've been successful over the past several years in getting cap relief in regards to additional visas, exemptions to, returning workers, and those different types of things over the years. But that's what Laurie's going to touch base on. We can help you through the application process, improving your temporary need, proving and testing the local labor market. But without the additional visas available, there's not much else we can do. And that's where it's so important that we all stay active and involved with our congressmen in getting these cap relief bills pushed across the finish line each and every year, because we have not had a permanent change since the early 90s. So with that, Laurie, I want to turn it over to you and just kind of tell everybody where we're at currently with the cap relief for potential for 2024 and what we can expect. Thank you for being here.
Great, Arnulfo, and thanks for having me, and thanks all of you for taking time this morning to log in and have a dialogue about where we are with the H2B program. I know for most of our members who have been using the program, it's really a roller coaster, and every year the question is, what are we going to get through Congress? What kind of cap relief are we going to get? When are we going to get it? And how will that impact me if I'm not in one of those very first processing groups? So one of the things I wanted to hit on is really we've seen the last several years, there's very little appetite in Congress to deal with the broader issues of immigration. And we can say this is not an immigration issue, this is a workforce issue, we have real labor challenges. But at the end of the day, what it really is we are grouped together with all things immigration policy, whether it be non-ag seasonal visas, the H2B program, or issues going on the border, or workforce verification, or big changes related to workers who are document challenged. All of those things in the eyes of Congress are getting lumped together. And so while we can really highlight our workforce needs, and this is really about labor and a way to address the labor needs, that is the key issue. And Congress, within this very partisan Congress, doesn't really have an appetite to take up a big comprehensive immigration bill, nor would there be agreement between the Republican House and the Democratic Senate. So one of the things that we've looked at, and the way we've gotten some partial cap relief every year for, almost the last 2 decades, has been through the federal appropriations process. And Congress does have to pass annual spending bills. So there's an annual spending bill for every single federal agency, and the ones we care about, as Arnulfo said, the H2B program deals with 3 federal agencies. The first is the temporary labor certification for the Department of Labor. The second is actually your approval of your petition through the Department of Homeland Security, which also maintains the cap, and then the State Department, which issues visas for the actual H2B workers at the consulates in their home countries. And so therefore, we care about spending bills that relate to the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Labor primarily, also state, but those 2 federal agencies. And the way the appropriations process works is the president submits his budget to Congress in February, and Congress comes up with a big budget for the entire federal government. And then each of the House and Senate appropriations bills work to pass their own legislation that funds each federal agency. There's a specific bill for the Department of Labor that's also grouped with the Department of Health and Human Services and some other federal agencies, and a Department of Homeland Security appropriations bill. In theory, these bills are supposed to be signed into law by October, and everything should be good to go. I think those of you who've been using the H2B program for a while know that this theoretical process doesn't always work. We usually end up with either a massive spending bill that groups all the federal spending for the entire government together in something called an omnibus bill, or we also likely have a series of short-term continuing resolutions that basically just continue to fund the federal government for a short period of time along the status quo. And we have a series of temporary spending measures until we get a final agreement. That's what we're likely looking at this year. Sometimes there's total disagreement and there's some short-term government shutdowns, but ultimately Congress must sign the federal spending bills into law and must pass, and then the president signs into law the federal spending bills, or else we end up with a government shutdown. So we know appropriations bills have to get signed into law, which is why we have the focus on that. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So the reason I went through that background is right now, Congress is in the thick of dealing with the federal appropriations bills. We had some good news out of the House. So the House Appropriations Committee passed at the end of June a bill that includes a 1-year returning worker exemption. That is the limit of annual appropriations bills. Generally, the relief is for 1 year. And I know you're signing contracts that go beyond that or don't necessarily align with the fiscal year, looking at long-term spending bills and capital investments. I know that 1 year is not ideal, but in getting an appropriations bill, that's politically usually limited to 1 year. So the House Appropriations Bill has a 1-year returning worker exemption that has a 3-year look back. So every returning worker, if they've received an H2B visa for one of the last 3 fiscal years, whether or not they worked for you or somebody else, would be cap exempt. We also have the Department of Labor funding bill, and the bill that came out of the House in July, out of the Appropriations Subcommittee, does include provisions that have been in law for the last several years since 2015 that allow for staggered crossing for seafood workers, being able to ramp up your season and bring workers in along a staggered time frame. It creates a maximum season of 10 months. The current federal regulations that are on the books have a 9-month season, but we've been able to continue it to be 10 months through this annual appropriations process. It also allows for some limited use of private wage surveys and prevents the Department of Homeland Security and Labor from enforcing provisions in the 2015 regulations related to the 3-quarter guarantee and corresponding employment. These are regulations that we are recommending our members follow because you could have retroactive enforcement if these provisions would not be enforced, but because the Department of Labor says we can't enforce them, but you're still bound by them. In the Senate, the Committee on Appropriations is taking up today the Department of Homeland Security Appropriations Bill and the Department of Labor Appropriations Bill. That committee, what's called a markup, where they bring up each bill, offer a series of amendments, and then vote a final bill out of committee. That's taking place now. It started at 10:30 Eastern today. So we'll have an update for you late today or sometime tomorrow, as that markup could go till well in the evening tonight. And we'll find out after that committee action what relief might be in there in the H2B program. But it's really good news that we have some really positive language in the House. We're hoping for some positive language in the Senate. So at the end of the day, however that appropriations process shapes out, we will be able to get some cap relief in a final spending bill and hopefully continue that regulatory relief that's been in law for the last several years. I want to thank all of you. I know several of our members came to DC about a month ago and did talk to their lawmakers about the importance of these provisions being in the appropriations bill. And also, many of you have continued to email or call your members of Congress and your senators asking for this relief when you get those calls to action from Arnulfo. So that really makes a big difference. Arnulfo and I spend a lot of time in DC talking to senators, talking to members of Congress and their staff about the H2B program, why these reforms are so important, why we need long-term relief, not just this year-to-year relief, but we at least need that Band-Aid fix so that we know that there'll be enough of visas to be able to accommodate our members who need the program. But it makes a big difference when we talk to senators and members of Congress and their staff every single day when they remember the conversations that they have with you. So those local connections, you know, I maintain this park or this school property, or we have an inn that brings a lot of tourism to the state, or we're a seafood processor and we're bringing revenue to the state, food to local restaurants. All of those things are so important, and those local stories make such a big difference. So I just want to thank each and every one of you for all the outreach you've done, not only this year, but over the past several years, to make sure we get some cap relief so our members can access this program and not be shut out because of that arbitrary 66,000 cap. There'll be future calls to action, probably over the summer and fall, to try to get into a final spending package, both cap relief and this regulatory relief, hopefully in the form of returning worker exemption. So thanks in advance for also heeding that action when you get those updates from our Arnulfo. If you can go to the next slide, please. So one of the things I also just wanted to mention is, I know some of our members have heard about some legislation that Senator Graham and Padilla, Republican from South Carolina and Democrat from California, are working on, that has really been negotiated between the Seasonal Employment Alliance and organized labor. We may see a bill introduced, you know, in the next week or so, or more likely in the fall, that would include some really positive cap relief, but also a lot of provisions that were coordinated with organized labor, and also some restrictions on the ability of some of our members, if they're in construction or the meatpacking industry, to use the program. This is not a bill that's been endorsed by the H2B Workforce Coalition that FEWA serves on the steering committee of, nor is it something that I would expect that the big coalition will endorse, because it will limit certain industries from using the program. And as our members in all different industry segments and the big H2B Workforce Coalition that we belong to are part of a big coalition, we believe if you meet the program criteria, you truly have that seasonal or peak load need, you should not arbitrarily be banned from using the program. There's also some challenges, as this was negotiated with organized labor, as well as the unions, various labor unions and Seasonal Employment Alliance. It was not negotiated with Republicans. We know that there are Republicans that also have concerns with the H2B program, but might not like and see a path to passing a bill that has a lot of provisions that organized labor wants. So I think this has a tough path. We'll keep you updated if that bill is introduced, but I wanted to make sure you're aware that those conversations are happening as well. And when we see final legislation, legislative text, FEWA will be looking at it closely, making a determination of what it means for our members and if it's something we can support or not. But in general, as I said, we will not support something that pits some of our members against each other, nor would the H2B Workforce Coalition. But with that, I will stop and turn it back to Arnulfo. We really wanted to be the bulk of this webinar to answer all of our members' questions and have a dialogue with you. So you've heard enough from me and Arnulfo. We'd really like to hear from you. So Arnulfo, I'll turn it back to you.
Hey, Laurie, thank you. That's a very, very good update for everyone. And while we're still on the Senate slide, I just wanted to reiterate how different this approach is in comparison to the approach that's happening through the appropriations process, right? This is a complete standalone bill and would have to go through the measures of passing the Senate, going to the House, House floor for vote, Senate floor for vote, and then ultimately signed by the president. And can you explain that process and how it's different from the appropriations?
Sure. So the appropriations process Congress has to do. Congress must pass federal spending bills to fund the federal government and keep the federal government operating. That's why we go there for relief, because we know it's something that has to be signed into law. A standalone bill is a piece of legislation. There are thousands introduced every single year, usually in the 3,000 range. Most of those get referred to a committee and there's never any action. It never gets to the Senate, to the president for his signature. A lot of times you may have a bill pass the House and not the Senate, or vice versa, because the Republican majority in the House can pass a bill without a lot of Democratic support. And on the Senate side, that's a little more challenging because there are filibuster rules. But in general, it is a longer term goal. And we have always had, as FEWA, a goal of passing permanent H2B relief. We want to solve this once and for all. We don't want our members to have to continue this roller coaster every year of what group am I in DOL, and will I get in under the cap, or am I going to have to look at supplemental visas or other cap relief, or and not be able to plan every year and have that uncertainty. We want long-term legislation. And this bill that's being discussed between Senator and Padilla is a really good start. There's some really good positive cap relief, but at the end of the day, we want a legislation that can get bipartisan support, not be seen as controversial, and get all the way to the president's desk. And that is a long-term goal that we have, but it is a long-term goal. The short-term goal is to make sure come October 1st and the start of the new fiscal year, all of our members are able to get the workers they need for 24 and fiscal year 25. As we go into a presidential election year next year, it makes the ability to get kind of big standalone legislation even harder to pass, because members of Congress and senators, and you've got a presidential election, they're talking about doing things that politically send a lot of messages, and there's not as much bipartisan compromise. So we'll keep an eye on that legislation. We'll continue to push for permanent reform that fixes this program for all of our members. But in the meantime, we don't want our members to have no relief, and that's why we're focusing in the short term on this appropriations process. I'll turn it back to you, Arnulfo.
Perfect. Thank you, Laurie. One question just to kind of clarify on what we mean by cap exempt. We know there's, the current limitation on the visas is 66,000, and they split that into two halves. The first half being issued 33,000 visas beginning October 1st, which is the beginning fiscal year for the government. So they're already looking at October 1st applications for fiscal year 2024 that were filed in early July. And the second half get released on April 1st, the 33,000 visas. What the current returning worker exemption states is that if you've received or had an H2B worker, or any H2B worker who's received and issued a visa within the last 3 fiscal years, is exempt from that number, from that 66,000. Therefore, you can plan to have those returning workers back for the 2024 season if this goes into play, and then any new workers that have never received a visa before will go into that 66,000 quota. This was last in play back in, I believe it was 2017, or maybe before that. I don't have those years in front of me. So it's been in place before. Maybe also touch base, Laurie, a little bit on the Cuellar bill last Congress and where we were at with that in regards to the returning worker exemption.
Sure. So last Congress, Congressman Cuellar, he is a Democrat from Texas, and Congressman Joyce, Republican from Ohio, and another bipartisan group of members of Congress that have really been champions on the H2B issue, introduced a bill that would create a permanent returning worker exemption and would also have some minor changes to the program, some streamlining and efficiency things, and some increased fines and penalties for wrongdoers. Obviously, we are so grateful that all of our members really adhere to product stewardship and taking care of their workers, both American and H2B workers. So we would support kind of that package. This year, that bill has not been reintroduced in the new session of Congress that convened in January. And the reason is two of our champions, Congressman Joyce and Cuellar, are the chairman and ranking member of the subcommittees on the House Appropriations Committee that oversee the Department of Homeland Security. Our other champions on the bill, Congressman Andy Harris from Maryland and Shelley Pingree from Maine, also serve on the Appropriations Committee. And they really wanted to focus all of their energy on getting some relief in the appropriations process because that is the thing that can get done this year. And all of them are committed to a permanent returning worker exemption. In fact, this year, when the draft bill that came out of the subcommittee in the House, it had a permanent returning worker exemption. That was ultimately changed just to a one-year fix. And the reason is there's committees that just deal with the federal spending, the appropriations committees, and then there's committees that deal with policy, real policy changes to the law that are not related to spending. And the one committee that has jurisdiction over immigration policy, and while we are not an immigrant visa program, it gets lumped in with immigration policy, is the Judiciary Committee. And the chairman and the subcommittee chairman on the Judiciary Committee come from kind of that Freedom Caucus ilk where all immigration is bad, whether it's a non-immigrant legal visa program, whether it's trying to provide relief for undocumented workers, it's all bad and in their minds. And this is the group that really wants to focus on a lot more border security before we could look at any additional visas, work visas and work authorizations. So we don't have that bill this year because we have the Champions and Appropriations Committee, and they know that they are in a position in leadership on that committee to try to affect something real that could get signed into law this year. Thanks, Arnulfo.
Perfect. That kind of rolls into quite a few questions that came in, and also to clarify. So, at this current time, the returning worker exemption is not a guarantee by any means. We're at the first big hurdle in regards to obtaining returning worker exemption, but talk about, kind of reiterate about that, and then also timing on when we can expect to know if the returning worker exemption will be in place for 2024.
Sure. So, as I said, in theory, we should know before the start of the fiscal year. But with Congress, that never happens. We usually have final spending bills wrapped up close to the end of December. So I would expect we will know where we stand with things at the end of December. But the one thing I would say is, and the FEWA team is so good about helping all of our members with this, when your workers are leaving this year, make sure you have copies of those visas. The more documentation and things that we can show that they have been here this year and held that visa, the more it does help if we can get that returning worker exemption. And your FEWA team leader will really help you navigate that process. We will keep you updated. I know it's really hard, especially if you're looking for employees for the winter season, starting October 1st, to not have this certainty in the law. But I want to be candid with all of our members. We probably won't know where that stands until December, but you've got a great team in FEWA that can help you navigate the process in anticipation of what laws might change and just trying to get your petitions all ready to go and processed, and hope for good luck that you're in one of those first processing groups. But if not, we hope before the majority of our members really need their workers that we can get some clarity in the law.
Thank you, Laurie. And just to talk briefly about our cap relief that we did receive for the 2023 season, this administration did basically double the quota and the amount of visas that are currently available. An additional 64,716 visas became available after the original quota was met, and that was divided into different areas depending on first half, second half, and some designated for certain areas of the country coming from the Northern Triangle. But the reason I mentioned that, Laurie, because I want you to also talk about what happens is if we get that continuing resolution. We understand that it's not, most likely will not happen by October 1st. We get a continuing resolution, and does that bill also continue with the current rider? And then what happens if we get a complete 1-year continuing resolution? What happens then?
Thanks, Arnulfo. That's such a great question. And the good news is what in law generally continues in law if we have a temporary spending bill or that continuing resolution. And so if you look at this year, fiscal year 2022, we did not have a final spending bill with that final discretionary language in law until the end of December 29th, it became law. But we had a continuing resolution that said that discretionary language that gives the Department of Homeland Security the ability to release those approximately 65,000 additional visas if U.S. businesses cannot find the seasonal workers they need. That provision continued under this continuing resolution. So we knew in October that the administration had announced that it planned to have this cap relief. And we are really grateful that the administration really recognizes the challenges in the labor market, especially for seasonal labor, and has heard us and heard the conversations that we've had over the years about how certainty is so important and being able to plan for your season and your peak times. So I am hopeful that even if we don't have a federal spending bill that wraps up in December, or if Congress can't agree on any federal spending bills and we have a year-long continuing resolution, that these provisions will continue and the administration will look at the regulations that already passed last year without having to go back to the drawing board and create something new. And we'll make that announcement early heading into October so all of our members can plan for what the situation might be in cap relief for the coming fiscal year and work with FEWA to make sure that if we don't get that returning worker exemption, we can continue that discretionary authority and help our members who don't get in one of the early processing groups at the Department of Labor to be able to plan to apply for those supplemental visas.
Perfect. And we have one question come in about the Northern Triangle. And at that time, following up on what Laurie just stated, is when the administration, so the current cap relief gives the authority to Department of Homeland Security to issue a maximum of 64,000 plus visas, and what they did this year was release the maximum, but then it's up to the administration to determine how those maximum number of visas that they do release are divided up, and if they do plan to allot for a certain amount for the Northern Triangle first half, second half. So it'll be up to the administration to decide that. Most likely, if it does come to a continuing resolution, and they will do something very, very similar to what they did this year, which is a certain allotment for the first half of this fiscal year, a certain allotment for the second half, and then also for the Northern Triangle again. That is if we do not get a returning worker, or if there's not a final bill put in place in regards to the returning worker exemption. One question, Laurie, I didn't have it in front of me, but when was the last time we did receive the returning worker exemption? And then talk about how that was or was not included in the House Appropriations bill.
Sure. So in 2016 was the last time we had a returning worker exemption in law. It worked really well because it didn't require the Department of Homeland Security and Labor to take any action. The returning worker exemption was in place from 2005 to 2007. And then we got caught up in some bigger politics around comprehensive immigration reform, and then the economy crashed. So the cap wasn't hit between 2009 and 2014. But then we were able to get that returning worker exemption in law again when we really needed it in 2016. But in 2017, opponents of the program became very vocal. Unfortunately, you have a program that works really well, and common sense lawmakers on both the Democrat and Republican side, especially in geographies where you have a lot of industries that use the program, really understand it. But you have the far left on that's very strongly supportive of organized labor, and the far right that's really supportive of any kind of immigration restrictions that band together to try to prevent reform. So we've always been able to get, for many years, a returning worker exemption through the House and not through the Senate. And the last time it got into final law is 2016. It was in the House, some House appropriations bills in 2017, but in closed door conversations at the leadership level with Speaker Pelosi and then House Speaker Ryan and the Senate leaders, they came up with this idea, let's just put it on the Department of Homeland Security to figure it out. But we're hoping dynamics are a little bit different this year. We have new leadership in the Senate Appropriations Committee, where we have a chairwoman and a ranking member, the top Democrat. Both of these women have supported the H2B program before, and Senator Collins, the top Republican on that committee, is one of the biggest champions of the returning worker exemption. We have a House committee that's already passed it with a Republican chairwoman who's really supportive of the program. So we feel like there's some real opportunities to try to get a returning worker exemption that haven't been there the last couple of years just because of political dynamics. And that works better than the discretionary authority. If nothing else, we're really glad we got the discretionary authority. So we had some hope for our members and the administration in releasing all these visas for this year, as opposed to previous years where we have had 15,000 or 30,000 visas released and regulations come out really late, a little bit too little too late. We're hoping that we can get that returning worker exemption because that would just take force and not require rulemaking, not require uncertainty. It just is a process that works a little bit better. And so we're hoping we really have an opportunity with some political dynamic changes this year to get that done.
Right, and just being in the base text alone is a huge, big first step, knowing that we're going to be at the table, when those negotiations happen. So that's great. Thank you, Laurie. If you have a few more minutes, I have a couple good questions that came in, and I know we scheduled for 30 minutes, so thank you. One question in regards to the construction industry was, does this program limit the use to construction industry? Currently, it does not. Any industry that can prove that you have a temporary seasonal need for labor can qualify for the program. Of course, we have to test the local labor market, but with the current unemployment rate, that's not the big issue. It's proving that you have a temporary seasonal need. The only reason why we brought the construction industry up earlier is because the Senate bill the Senate proposed bill that could be announced will limit construction entirely. So the current program does not limit the current construction industry. Just wanted to clarify on that. Let me get through these questions here. A few more that just came in. One came in about the eligible country list. We do know that many of you know that there's an H2A, H2B eligible country list that gets published by the Department of State and Immigration each calendar year. That normally gets published in January. Any of these reforms to the bill will not address the approved country list. That is determined by the Department of State, and the U.S. consulate and embassy in their home country is determined on the return rate of not only the H2 visas, but all visas issued for that specific country, tourist visas, spousal visas, any visas that get applied for that country. If they find that those individuals are not returning when they're supposed to, they can find themselves on the ineligible list to process. Belize recently fell off the approved country list in the past few years as an example, because the return rate, not only on H2s, and it could have been not H2s at all, but it could have been tourist visas or any other visas that could affect that. So that's how that is determined, and that is issued each calendar year, but none of these rules or regulations or legislation actually addresses that or can address that. Any other questions, John? I think I covered them most, but I've been kind of looking through as we've been talking.
I believe that pretty much covered most of them.
Okay. Well, Laurie, again, thank you so much for your time, and I appreciate talking to our members and our audience today. And if we did not get a chance to cover your question, I have my direct contact information up for you. You'll also get a follow-up email and just letting us know if you have any follow-up questions on your specific program and how to apply for next year. Many of our members have already started the renewal process and the new membership application as well for 2024. As we have started submitting the prevailing wage applications to the U.S. Department of Labor already. They adjust those prevailing wage every July 1st, so we like to get those submitted early, as it can take anywhere from 2 to 3 months before we can even get the prevailing wage back that is determined by the U.S. Department of Labor. So get started on your process if you have not already. I'm happy to answer any direct questions that you may have. Shoot me an email, give me a call directly. I'm happy to help. And Laurie, thanks again for your time. I really appreciate you speaking with us today.
Great. Thanks for having me. And thanks to everyone for taking the time to talk about this with Arnulfo and I. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a great day.